Good afternoon. Welcome to this session with the title Law in Action, Defending a Nation in Cyberspace. Joining me as the speakers are Jeff Koseff from the United States Naval Academy, Kenneth Kraszewski from the University of Helsinki, and Kadri Kaska from the NATO CCD-COE. So first, a few organizational remarks. I will introduce all of the speakers and the topics that they will focus on in their presentations. Each of the speakers has 15 to 20 minutes for his or her presentation. And after each presentation, we will take 2 questions related directly to that presentation, which should leave us with some time after all of the presentations where you can ask broader questions to multiple speakers at the same time. So let's proceed with the first presentation. If we would like to connect the title of this panel with the presentation, I think that in the discussions whether and how international law applies to cyberspace, people sometimes forget that it's the states and their policies that shape the law. And the states are testing the limits, and Jeff has written a great article about a US operational concept called Defend Forward from 2018 and what limits international law imposes on this operational concept. Jeff, the floor is yours.
I'll try to get to the podium. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I have to give a few disclaimers first. I'm a lawyer, so I like giving disclaimers. I'll probably give a lot of them. First is that I'm speaking only on my own behalf, not on behalf of the Naval Academy, Department of Navy, Department of Defense, nobody else. The second is that I'm going to be talking about DoD operational concepts and strategies in cyber, which obviously there is a good deal of classified material involved overall in cyber. That is not what this is about. This is all based on publicly available documents that DoD has released in media coverage. So this is all public domain information that I'll be talking about. And the third, and this is really what I wanted to drive home what the overall topic of my paper and concept is that I'm not looking to have the normative discussion about whether defending forward is appropriate, whether we should be. What I'm looking at as a lawyer is what are the limits on defending forward. Now, I think there are a lot of incredibly important normative discussions that need to be had, and I encourage all of you to have them. But what we're going to talk about today is what defend forward is and what international law allows. So as was said, I'm at the Naval Academy. I was a civilian, or I'm a civilian professor, but I was in the private sector representing companies on cybersecurity matters. When I got to the Naval Academy, one thing that I learned is there are a lot of acronyms in the military. Acronyms that I have no idea. I Google them all the time, and they're actually useful. And the most useful acronym that I've seen is BLUF, which I had no idea what it meant until I got to the Naval Academy, and that's bottom line up front. So my BLUF for this presentation is that international law provides significant leeway for nations, including the United States, to defend forward in cyberspace. So what I first want to do is talk about what defend forward is, because this concept came out a little over a year ago, and there was a big brouhaha in the press about what's defend forward. Does that mean that we're going to be changing the rules of international law? And it's really much more nuanced and far less of a magnitude than was initially reported. So to understand it, you have to first understand this concept of continuous engagement or persistent engagement. That's really the strategy that came out through the Cyber Command's vision statement in 2018, as well as the DoD's unclassified summary of its cyber strategy. And what continuous engagement basically says is that we need to impose friction and costs on our adversaries. So that's the strategy of continuous engagement. But how do we do that? That's where defend forward comes. And one of the things that defend forward has been referred to as a strategy, and it's not. It's an operational concept that supports persistent engagement. And in the Cyber Command vision, Cyber Command wrote that we want to defend forward as close as possible to the origin of adversary activity. And that's rightly seen as a pretty big statement and a shift from previous statements that the DoD has made in 2011 and 2015 in strategy documents, where it is focused on what's known as active defense or active cyber defense. And the key difference here is we're talking about being as close as possible to the origin. So what this strongly implies is not just looking at the DoD's perimeter, not looking once you get to the DoD network. Now, where is as close as possible to the origin? There's not really a direct statement as to what that is. You could think it might be within US, other networks, non-DoD within the US. Could be in the red zone where the adversary is operating. It also could be in the zone of a third party where the adversary is operating. But it's clearly saying we're going to look at other areas where we need to defend forward. Now, the aims of Defend Forward, this was really articulated in this unclassified summary that DoD released of its cyber strategy. And that's, again, disrupting or halting the malicious activity, including activity that falls below the level of armed conflict. And that's key here. So I will be the first to admit, when I teach about international law applied to cyber, my first instinct is to start talking about self-defense under jus ad bellum and necessity and proportionality of self-defense, what's an armed attack, and those are all incredibly important discussions to have. But the reality that we're facing is that a lot of our threats are underneath this armed attack level, underneath the use of force, but that doesn't make them any less significant, and there's something that needs to be addressed. So that's clearly one of the issues that Defend Forward is looking at, is how do we address these sub-armed attack issues? So that's what I want to do today, is talk about the international law assessment of Defend Forward. So the clearest indication that I've seen publicly of what Defend Forward is came from a newsletter that Cyber Command's Public Affairs Office put out late last year, where it talked about 3 lines of effort of Defend Forward: positioning, warning, and influence. And so what I want to do is go through these 3 lines of effort and talk about what limits and what capabilities are permitted under international law. So the first line of effort is called positioning. So that's talking about this forward cyber posture that you can leverage to persistently degrade the adversary's effectiveness. So that's the description, and I think it really needs to be broken down into 2 different activities to really do an international law analysis of it. The first would be establishing that position. So what do you do to establish the position? Whether it's just preparing, that would probably be the least, raise the fewest legal issues, all the way to leveraging that position, which might raise more issues that we have to deal with under international law. So if you're just establishing the position, some legal scholars might say, depending on what you're doing, that's going to be fine. We don't need to worry about the international law justifications. But if you're establishing a position, for example, by implanting malware, that could be seen, at least by some, as raising some sovereignty issues. So that's something that we really have to address. And then separately, what we need to address is if you're actually leveraging that position to cause harm, whether it's erasing data, degrading the capability of a certain operation, that could be seen as raising some sovereignty issues. So how do we deal with that? If we're moving to a point where you could be dealing with some international law issues, and the clearest answer to this would be countermeasures. So, and this was discussed in the president's speech earlier today. I think countermeasures are increasingly being seen as an option to deal with all of these sub-armed attacks, sub-use of force threats that we're facing. And for many issues that the United States faces, countermeasures are a viable way to deal with them. So there are limits on countermeasures. First is that basically you can only exercise a countermeasure if if the state that you're targeting with countermeasures has committed an internationally legally wrongful act. And the goal of the countermeasure is to stop that violation. So you might first see this as being a significant limit, and in many ways it is. But given the nature of the threats that we're facing, the persistent attacks that we're facing, I think it's probably less of a limit in a number of the situations that we're facing, because these are constant attacks that are not stopping. The adversary is always trying to harm our networks, harm our systems, harm our data, harm our people. So the countermeasures, I think, more likely will be continuous. And I think this requires a bit of a shift from how we've thought about cyber legal issues before, where we've thought about them as these discrete episodic events, which in some cases they are, but in a lot of cases it's just going to keep happening. So the countermeasures, just as the attacks are persistent, I think the countermeasures also can have this continuous impact. Countermeasures also have to be proportionate. And so this does not mean that your countermeasure has to take the same form as the initial harm that you experienced. But the rough magnitude, at least there are a few different interpretations of what proportionality would mean, but the magnitude has to be commensurate with the injury suffered. So I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind. But I think, again, depending on what level of countermeasures, I think that would be reasonable given the harm that we're suffering. The next line of effort is warning. So the way that Cyber Command has defined it is enhanced warning of adversary actions, intentions, and capabilities to better defend government and civilian networks, data, and platforms. So this gathering information about cyber threats and using the information about cyber threats would fall under the warning line. So a lot of what would fall under warning, I don't think would necessarily raise any significant concerns under international law. I would say if there's gathering open source information, and I think there's a lot that is available open source, and I think that would raise no concerns under international law. When we get to espionage, now that's where there's probably at least some controversy at this point. There's obviously no per se rule against peacetime espionage, although I would say once there's more widespread surveillance and data collection, there are at least some who might argue that strays into the lane of violating international law. So I think it would, so depending on what form the information gathering is taking, that could raise some concerns. Also, what would raise some concerns under international law would be if, while gathering the information, we were to cause damage to the systems. That, at least under some frames of analysis, could create international legal issues. So that's also a limit to keep in mind when conducting warning operations. The final prong of Defend Forward is influence. And the way Cyber Command defines this is encouraging stability by disabusing adversaries of the idea they can operate with impunity in cyberspace. So this, again, depending on what form it takes, a lot of this could be anything from diplomacy to sanctions to expelling diplomats, closing embassies, those sorts of things. And those would all, I would say, fall under the category of retortion, which are unfriendly acts that don't, in and of themselves, raise legal concerns. Now, there are other ways to exercise influence that could be more creative. For example, if there were to be a message, and this is from public media reports, a message sent to individual cyber operators in other nations, not with a threat, but just a message essentially letting them know that we know they're there, that also could be something that would be influence. I think just sending a message and not raising a threat, I don't think that in and of itself would raise any significant legal concerns. However, if you start threatening them, those sorts of things, that's where there could be humanitarian issues. So there would be some limits on that. Obviously, if you influence by causing damage, as we talked about before, that would have to fall under law of countermeasures or any other legal justifications. So the bottom line that I started with at the beginning of this talk is that there is significant leeway, even if we're not suffering or experiencing an armed attack or a use of force, there still is significant leeway to exercise measures to fight this persistent threat that we're facing. And I think Defend Forward is a step in that direction of recognizing that we can't just have our legal analysis and our operational analysis look at sort of the awful sort of cyber Pearl Harbor scenario that's been talked about for years, which hopefully we don't experience. But instead, what we need to do is adjust both our legal and operational thinking to analyze these persistent threats that we're facing. And I think that under international law, we obviously face limits, but we also do have significant leeway to address them, and most importantly, prevent them from happening in the first place. So with that, I think that's what I have for now, and happy to take questions afterward.
So to give you some time to think about your questions, I already prepared one for Jeff. So my question is about justifying some of those more intrusive activities as countermeasures, mostly those positioning, the positioning heading. So the countermeasures, they are defined in the articles on state responsibility, but I think they are defined there pretty restrictively. There's a lot of conditions. They're made quite difficult to invoke. It's a self-help measure. And the UK Attorney General has already stated last year that some of the conditions they just wouldn't apply to countermeasures when it comes to cyber operations. So do you think that the Defend Forward concept will also have an impact on the opinion juris in the United States or elsewhere?
I think so, and I hope so, because I think I agree with the UK Attorney General. I think one of the big concerns was the notification requirement of having to notify of exercising countermeasures, and that clearly is not something that could easily be applied in cyber. But I also think that for some of the requirements for countermeasures, you could still comply. It's just rethinking how you frame it. So, for example, when the countermeasure has to be intended to cease the unlawful activity, if you look at it as if you look at the unlawful activity as one discrete event, and that discrete event has stopped and isn't happening, then that might be difficult to justify. But if you look at what you're trying to stop as this continued campaign, I think that that's a way that would justify these these longer term countermeasures.
Thank you. So, okay, Przemek, the guy in the fourth row with the red ribbon.
Hi, my name is Przemysław Roguski. I'm a lecturer in international law at the University of Krakow, and I have basically two questions which dig a little bit on the question of sovereignty. So you're saying about that the concept of defending forward can be justified by recourse to countermeasures. However, countermeasures would presuppose, I would say, that this activity is considered as wrongful, subject to these justification of countermeasures. So, is your understanding of the U.S. position as implying that the countermeasures can be taken only in response to a previous wrongful act, or is it more to be read along the lines of what the UK Attorney General has said, that there is no question of sovereignty in cyberspace at all, and therefore low-level activities that would have been taken just don't fall into this category of countermeasures because they do not constitute a wrongful act in the first place? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm not speaking for the United States position on anything. I'm speaking for my position on it, and I would say that depending on what the act is, I might just have a different framing of what would constitute a sovereignty violation, and there's still, there are some people who would say that even interference in the elections with interference in voting equipment, that sort of thing, some might say that's not a violation of either sovereignty or non-intervention. I would strongly disagree with that. So I still think that, I think you could reconcile the UK Attorney General's position, but not necessarily say that these are not sovereignty violations. So I think it partly depends on what the countermeasure actually is. So the countermeasures that I would, I mean, if you start talking about actually causing damage to equipment, I think that gets close enough to the line that I'm a lawyer, so I tend to be risk averse. I would probably want to be able to justify that as a countermeasure, but I think it is justifiable.
Yes.
So you mentioned in your speech about countermeasures such as expelling diplomats, which would work against potential state actors, but my question is, how would defending forward work in regards to non-state actors? And do you have like an example of a countermeasure we can do when facing a non-state actor?
Yeah, so I think that's going to, I think that's going to be the topic of the next presentation. So I'll defer to my colleague on that. But I mean, I think attribution is key. I mean, I think that's where you need to have attribution to be able to do that.
Okay, I think we can take one more question.
Hi, sir. Cadet Brian McKenrick, West Point. One of the specific points you had was about warning and gathering intelligence. Mm-hmm. So do you think that if, say, the U.S. with the defending forward were to gather intelligence on foreign citizens without their knowledge in order to try to predict an attack coming towards us, would that cross some line of an internationally wrongful act, or would that be okay?
Gathering information on non-U.S. citizens who are not in the United States?
Yes.
No, I mean, we do that. I mean, I think that would be espionage. I think that wouldn't, for me, that wouldn't raise concerns. I think others might disagree with me on that point, but I mean, I think just generally, if it's just traditional signals intelligence, if we're going after people obviously who are in the United States or who are U.S. persons, that's a whole different story.
So thank you, and let's continue with the idea of law in action. I would say that the issue with some publications on international law and cyberspace is that sometimes they are really thorough on the legal side, but when you read them, you ask yourself, where's the cyber in it? Where are the facts? But that's why we like Kenneth's abstract and also the paper so much, because the legal analysis is so focused and relevant on one particular incident. He selected the Samsung incident, and he demonstrated how international law applied to it. So, Kenneth.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kenneth Krzyzewski. I'm a doctoral student in law at the University of Helsinki, as well as being just a regular corporate lawyer at a Finnish business law firm. The subject of my research is international law governing below the threshold of use of force cyber operations. I'm honored to be speaking before all of you today and for the opportunity to learn from so many distinguished scholars and professionals in the cyber field. This is my first CyCon, so I'm very excited to be here speaking. The topic of my presentation today is the ransomware campaign that came to international attention in March 2018. At that time, the government of a major American city, Atlanta, was targeted by a sophisticated ransomware campaign. Atlanta's main court, called the busiest court in the American Southeast, was unable to validate warrants. Police officers were forced to issue citations by hand, and the city's employment application portal was shut down. Most crucially, years of digital files were rendered inaccessible. The attack was costly. Its perpetrators demanded $51,000 to restore Atlanta's systems to full functionality, but the city followed the advice of federal authorities and refused payment. 1 month later, Atlanta had spent over $2.5 million to restore its systems, and an additional $9.5 million was later requested. However, Atlanta was not alone in its misery. The same hacking group and malware were implicated in attacks on hospital and health service providers and municipal governments across the United States. While other similar attacks like WannaCry, Petya, and NotPetya were much larger scale events, SamSam ransomware attacks also deserve an international law analysis. And because its effects manifested in a single state, that analysis is perhaps more straightforward. This presentation considers the attacks on healthcare providers and municipal governments through the lens of the Tallinn Manual. First, I will discuss the SamSam ransomware and the group behind it. Then I will explain how the incidents might be classified under international law. Finally, I will discuss the possible responses available to the United States. As you can see here on this slide, there were many victims of these attacks. Primarily, the group targeted municipalities such as the cities of Atlanta, Georgia, Newark, New Jersey, as well as the Port of San Diego and the Colorado Department of Transportation. Also, healthcare providers were affected, specifically hospitals in Los Angeles, Wichita, Kansas, and Omaha, Nebraska, as well as some medical services companies in Maryland and Illinois. In total, there were over 200 victims. US $6 million was made in ransom payments, and there were at least an additional 30 million in losses. The SamSam ransomware was unique in that it was directly targeted. The perpetrators specifically chose these healthcare providers and municipalities, and once they had access to the systems, they manually encrypted files. They then left a slightly apologetic ransom note demanding several bitcoins in ransom. The ransom was set at an amount that would be deemed affordable to the victims. Initially, it was reported that the group behind it was deemed Gold Lowell and was suspected to reside in Eastern Europe. However, on November 26, 2018, 2 Iranian nationals were indicted for the crime. Not surprisingly, Iran has not extradited these individuals to the United States. For a cyber operation such as the SamSam ransomware campaign to constitute an internationally wrongful act, it must be a breach of an international obligation owed to another state, and it must be attributable to a state. Setting aside the question of attribution for a moment, I will first question whether the SamSam campaign was a breach of an international obligation owed by one state to another. In the cyber context, the most relevant breaches of international obligation are these 4. Use of force, prohibited intervention, violation of sovereignty, and a violation of the duty of due diligence. I will examine the first 3, but due to the time constraints of this presentation, I will omit discussion of due diligence because that is a bit tricky to discuss and doesn't apply to the SamSam attacks because, as we will see, no state is directly implicated. The UN Charter prohibits the use or threat of use of force by one state against the territorial integrity or political independence of another. While the threshold for what constitutes a use of force in cyberspace is unsettled, the Tallinn Manual proposes 8 factors that states are likely to consider, which I will discuss in relation to the SamSam operations. Severity is considered the most important factor, and crucially, the overall severity of the SamSam attacks was low. While the potential for serious harm to result from the disruption of hospital and municipal services is high, in none of the incidents did such harm actually occur. Secondly, immediacy. The consequences of the SamSam attacks did not follow immediately from the cyber activities. In most cases, the penetration of affected systems occurred weeks before the ransom notice was directed to the victim, and the monetary costs actually incurred by the victims to recover data and restore their systems followed weeks or months thereafter. Thirdly, directness. The effects of the SamSam attacks were not directly connected to the underlying cyber activity. While the attacks did have indirect consequences in the form of costs incurred to restore backed up data and to implement improved security, the directness of the cause and effects is in no way comparable to the direct harm, for example, suffered by a kinetic explosion. The attacks were indeed invasive. Gold Lowell did invasively probe the networks of municipal governments and healthcare providers. However, these were not top secret networks, and they were not necessarily intended to have the highest level of security. For instance, Atlanta's emergency response networks were not touched. Measurability of effects is also a problem with these attacks. The effects cannot be calculated with certainty, even if a numerical sum can be affixed to some of the costs to improve security in the future. There's no suggestion that these incidents had a military character. No state's military was implicated, nor was the American military the target of any of the attacks. State involvement. No state is publicly alleged to have been involved, either directly or indirectly. And finally, presumptive legality. Certainly the reconnaissance and network probing activities of the group are very similar to espionage, and espionage is not per se regulated under international law. So on consideration of each of these 8 factors, the attacks fail to meet the criteria of a use of force. A cyber operation that falls below the use of force threshold may still be a breach of the customary international law principle of non-intervention. In the cyber context, the principle prohibits coercive intervention by cyber means by one state into the internal or external affairs of another. Thus, an intervention consists of 2 elements. It relates to the internal or external affairs of a state, and it is of coercive nature. SamSam attacks do not contain both of these elements. While disturbing the operations of municipal courts and state transportation officials is clearly an intervention in the internal affairs of the US, it is not coercive in the strict legal sense that it was designed to compel the US to adopt policies regarding those particular internal affairs. It wasn't designed to compel the US to adopt municipal court or transportation policies. It was designed to compel the US to pay money. The SamSam attacks could also be a violation of the United States' sovereignty. A violation of sovereignty can be either a violation of territorial borders or an interference or usurpation of an inherently governmental function. The Tallinn Manual proposes that causing a loss of functionality by cyber means is sufficient to constitute a violation of territorial borders. SamSam attacks undoubtedly did this. That was their whole purpose. Moreover, the attacks targeted inherently governmental functions, those of courts and of the police. Thus, it can be concluded that the ransomware campaign was certainly a violation of sovereignty. And if attributable to a state, it would constitute an internationally wrongful act, which then brings this presentation to a discussion of attribution. As we all know, attribution is especially difficult in cyberspace. But based on publicly available information, we can rule out that the SamSam attacks were either the acts of state organs or were the acts of state organs placed at the disposal of another state. However, it is still possible under international law that the acts of non-state groups can be attributed to a state under certain circumstances. Acts by non-state actors are attributable to a state if the non-state actor is acting on the instructions of a state or acting under the direction and control of a state. This latter implies that the state determines the execution and course of a cyber operation and has the authority to order its commencement and cessation. Now, as I keep saying, as far as I can determine from publicly available sources of information, as I am just a civilian lawyer and don't really know what is going on behind the scenes, Gold Lowell was not acting on the instruction or under the direction and control of a state. So we're not able to attribute its actions to a state. Because I have, hopefully I have established that although the attacks were a violation of US sovereignty, they are not attributable to a state and cannot be considered an internationally wrongful act. So what are the possible responses of the United States? International law provides 4 general possibilities. countermeasures, the plea of necessity, self-defense, or taking action in self-defense, and retorsion. Countermeasures are unlawful actions, but for the fact that they are taken in response to another state's internationally unlawful act and are designed to terminate that act or compel the attributable state to make reparations. However, the object of countermeasures must be a state, and it is not possible to attribute the SamSam attacks to a state. There must also be an internationally wrongful act to justify countermeasures. And even if there was in this case, countermeasures have to be limited to ensuring that the unlawful act stops, obtaining assurance and guarantees of non-repetition, and compelling the responsible state to make reparations. You cannot take countermeasures for a purely punitive or retaliatory reason. The US would be wise to avoid taking countermeasures in this situation, as by doing so, it would itself be in violation of international law. The plea of necessity is likewise not available to the United States in this situation. The plea of necessity can be asserted to take action against non-state actors, and it can justify actions that violate the rights of non-responsible states, but only if the threat to the injured state is sufficiently grave and imminent, and there are no other means of safeguarding that essential interest. State attribution is not a precondition for taking action based on the plea of necessity. What constitutes a state's essential interest is not clearly defined, but it would certainly include the sort of things that were affected by the SamSam attacks, like healthcare, justice, and policing. However, it is unlikely that a temporary interruption in the functionality of these systems in just a few cities is sufficient to put those essential interests in grave and imminent peril. And it is also unlikely that the US would have no other means to safeguard those interests. And finally, in any case, the ransomware attacks have stopped, and the plea of necessity can only be invoked to end the harmful activity. The third response possibly available to the US is taking an action in self-defense. This is probably the least viable option. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, a state may respond with force to a cyber operation that qualifies as an armed attack. There's some dispute between states as to what constitutes an armed attack. The majority view is that only grave uses of force are that, but the US has consistently held that any use of force is an armed attack. Since we are talking about the United States, that is the view that is relevant, but even under that view, the SamSam campaign can't be considered a use of force, and so the US may not respond with force in self-defense. Which brings us to the only viable option, which is retorsion. Retorsion is lawful retaliation in kind for another country's unfriendly or unfair action. It is the best legal response available to the United States in dealing with the SamSam attacks. Acts of retortion are lawful, although unfriendly. For example, a state may respond by suspending diplomatic relations, restricting travel rights, or expelling foreign nationals, or preventing the use of its cyber infrastructure for communications. Retorsion is the only way the US can really respond to the SamSam ransomware campaign without a determination that another state has breached an international obligation owed to the US. The SamSam ransomware campaign disrupted healthcare organizations and municipal services in numerous locations across the US. Undoubtedly, the actions were malicious cyber operations carried out by foreign actors, implicating the rights of the US under international law. But to be considered internationally unlawful acts, the ransomware campaign would have to constitute a breach of an international law obligation. The attacks were neither uses of force nor coercive interventions. And while violations of US sovereignty, the attacks are not attributable to a state. Thus, the attacks do not qualify as internationally unlawful acts, and it limits the possible recourse for the US. As we have seen, countermeasures, the plea of necessity, and self-defense are not suitable responses. Retorsion is the only legal response available to the US. It's not a particularly satisfying outcome and demonstrates the difficulty faced by states in using international law to respond to modern cyber attacks. Thank you. That ends my presentation.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually have a question on one of the topics. When you considered if the incident was a prohibited intervention, you came to the conclusion that while it did implicate the internal affairs of the United States, it was not coercive. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that, assuming that we can attribute the incident if a state demands ransom from another state, like from its budget, isn't that clearly coercive?
Yes, well, to be considered a coercive intervention, you have to intervene in the internal affairs in a coercive manner. So what you're trying to compel the state to do is to modify those internal affairs. What happened in this case is the perpetrators sought money. To be a coercive intervention in municipal affairs or traffic affairs, they would have to be seeking to force those cities to take particular policies regarding traffic or healthcare, not simply seeking money.
Great, thank you. So, questions from the audience?
Hello, thanks a lot for the presentation. My name is Tilman Rodenhäuser from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I would have a question. You said you did not mention due diligence, but to me a situation where we have a non-state actor operating from one state and it's not attributable to any state. If we think about responses and responsibilities, I think due diligence is actually quite pertinent, and I would be interested to hear your views, especially with regard to what means or what responses are available to a state if another state is not willing to halt these wrongful acts by non-state actors. Thanks.
Yes, I didn't, thank you for the question. I didn't discuss due diligence because it's particularly complicated, and I didn't want to spend so much of the presentation speaking about due diligence. But the problem here for me is it's not clear, or when I was writing the article, it wasn't clear who perpetrated these attacks. So I had to speculate a lot about what state the US would have to ask to take actions to stop these attacks. I mean, the obligation of due diligence is that if you are aware or reasonably should be aware that actions are emanating from your state that implicate the rights of another state, you as the territorial state have an obligation to end those actions or to take reasonable efforts to end those actions. So it wasn't clear to me whether, and I discussed this a bit in my article, but it wasn't clear whether the United States had asked any other state to take actions to stop those, whether any territorial state, I guess Iran in this situation, whether Iran had agreed to take actions, had taken actions and just failed to stop them, had refused to take actions, or there's a lot of possibilities of what could have taken place, and none of it is publicly available.
Yes, one more question.
Hi, thank you. Raquel Garbers, Department of National Defense, Canada. I'd actually like to ask the first presenter a comment about the second presenter's argument. When the second presenter sort of worked through the possible responses, right, you can see that they are all designed to make an action, a sort of discrete action finish. It's retaliation in kind. So it's all very circumscribed and extremely limiting from a deterrence perspective. So given that construct, in that example, how would you reconcile that with your position that there's significant leeway for states to take action?
Yeah, so I think that, that's a really good point, and I think that it really depends on what you're going after and what you're trying to respond to. So this is a fairly discrete incident. What I'm looking at are the continuous campaigns. I would say one would be Russia with election interference, perhaps China's attacks on U.S. companies and their intellectual property. That would be something more that is something that we see continuously. I think the Atlanta incident, this was something where I would say was more episodic, which I think we discussed. Yep. Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I think that I think you're exactly right that once there is a pattern, and if I mean, part of it does get to the attribution and see what source it's coming from. So just the fact that we've had a few ransomware incidents, that I don't think would necessarily be a pattern that would allow this continuous response. So I mean, a lot of it really does depend on the intelligence that we're gathering about where this is coming from and whether it is episodic, whether it is a continuing pattern, and whether it's ceased. So I mean, I think it really does require an evaluation of the circumstances.
So I think it's time for the third presentation. One of the main postulates of Tallinn Manual 2.0 is that each state has territorial sovereignty and exercises jurisdiction over the cyber infrastructure in its territory. So it's both in its interest and its right to prevent adversary activities in its territory. And the advent of 5G networks will lead to an even higher risk of these adversary activities. So Kadri, as the lead author of a recent CCD COE paper on 5G, is best suited to talk about the issues raised by this technology. Kadri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the introduction, and a very good afternoon from my side as well to all of you. Well, actually, when Thomas approached me with a proposal to discuss on the CyCon stage how international law is operating in action in dealing with mundane realities of real life, I found the idea rather intriguing. But I must also admit that whatever title we conjured up, we are definitely not striving to conceptualize sort of new thought for supply security. It's rather really what I would like to do is contextualize international law in action against a particular case, which is the looming or awaited deployment of 5G networks, and which is hence not an incident, not an existing or happened operation, but a risk arising of a potential reliance of a supplier in awareness of the context of that supplier coming from an autocratic system of an adversarial state. So I would first, I have this little thing here. What I would first do is give you sort of an overview of that mundane reality. So the 5G study that we published this year together with our esteemed moderator and another colleague of the CCD COE, and which was called Huawei 5G and China as a security threat. And then by means of introduction, really, rather than an in-depth analysis, which I think consider the previous speaker provided a very good example of taking an actual case and putting it through the various legal tests. But I will merely refer to the international law frameworks we analyzed and found applicable, and then discuss our sort of broader reflections on the role of and on the expectation of on the legal expertise, legal experts, especially when it comes to the realities that are faced by the legal community, and not just the legal community in small states. And let's face it, small states make up about 2/3 of both NATO allies and EU member states in our context. So what's the West's issue with 5G and Huawei exactly? We've heard that throughout the course of this the drafting process. We heard the question ad nauseum, really. Why is Huawei an issue if there is no smoking gun? And and also by means of sort of scoping, we did discuss really or analyze the 5G issue alone. We didn't venture into and the current debates regarding the US executive order around Huawei's broader product range, where we're not in our scope, so I will not touch upon that. But we looked at Huawei as a 5G supplier from 3 angles. So first, the role of 5G in our, or expected or envisioned role of 5G in our increasingly digitally dependent societies, especially looking into the future, and the role 5G is expected to have, admitting that no one can quite imagine what the ecosystem of new products and services and processes will look like and lead to. Then, secondly, we looked at Huawei's current contested position in the market and the factors that have brought it there, as well as its track record of to date of engagement in cyber espionage or economic espionage. And then finally, we looked at China's legal and political environment, its economic or pattern of economic cyber espionage, and acknowledging that economic capacity has for a while really been, or for a long time been, China's preferred means of, or to achieving and exerting geopolitical influence. So why 5G? Why the attention? Especially for the legal and policy community, 5G is a sort of, for many of us, the 5G term is something floating in the air, perceived as something that will at some point bring us better data speeds. But it's one thing is very clear: it's not just better for 4G. I wish we had time for the nice video we presented at the report launch, but there's plenty of good material to illustrate sort of the diversity and the capacity of the potential 5G solutions. I do recommend to look them up if you're interested in getting a better glimpse of the looming future. We are talking about, when we talk about 5G, we are talking about the qualitative jump. So lower latency, meaning better connection times, the possibility to simultaneously connect to more devices, and more versatile devices, products, solutions from all domains of human life: media, medical, transportation, education, government functions, whatnot. So it's not an exaggeration to consider 5G as really the digital nervous system of our increasingly digital societies. And from a cybersecurity point of view, we can be pretty much assured that the old, or the ecosystem, in a sense, will not undergo a fundamental change, meaning that anything that can be abused or used can also be abused, meaning that all those cool gadgets and processes and services will be both targets and potentially also means of cyber attack, cyber operations. So due to such integrated role of 5G networks in the society as an enabler and for societal and economic and governance functions, it will be, and communications infrastructure essential for the functioning of our contemporary societies. And it will bear dependencies and dependence risks for not just the communication sector, but all other interconnected and interreliant sectors, including those cross-border. So, and of course, once installed and deployed, or once you opt for a certain technology, the decision to simply revert or switch to another provider and another type of solution may not be something that is easily done. The cost may be prohibitive. It may or it will probably require changing architecture and other complications like that. So the choice is really considering the significance of the new generation of communications networks for the society. It can't really be viewed as a merely technocratic step or decision. The risk assessment and the risk understanding has to be done earlier, or before the critical decisions are taken. So why Huawei? The company has over the recent years grown into the largest telecoms provider or telecoms equipment manufacturer globally. It is currently the only company that can provide all the elements of a 5G network at cost and scale, meaning its closest competitors can provide segments or can provide elements of 5G networks, but not the entire range. And it has very clearly stated its ambition to acquire market dominance in provision of 5G services and equipment. And Huawei and other Chinese telecoms companies also have gained rather significant role also in 5G standards development. So when in 4 or 2 and 3G communications networks, their role was marginal, if even that. It has grown with 4G, and now with 5G standards and intellectual property rights, they hold. Chinese companies hold about 1/10 of all the critical or core standards, and Huawei has the largest proportion of it. And so why the fuss? The main claim, as I mentioned in the beginning of the skeptics, has been that today there have been no significant exploitable vulnerabilities in Huawei, in any of Huawei's products. And that means that we cannot really talk about an incident, or we cannot talk about an operation that has been identified. And it is important that we distinguish between an actual breach and evidence of an actual breach and the risk of a breach or exploitation. So we are not talking about responding and the options to respond to an actual incident. We are talking about risk assessment and feasible risk assessment measures to which the legal frameworks that set their limits and to which the legal advice has to be aware of and has to recognize. So what we do know is that Huawei's track record in terms of cyber and economic cyber espionage is not exactly blameless. There's quite a few court cases in the US. There's ongoing or court convictions also in earlier years. There are currently Canada and Poland have detained Huawei's employees for alleged cyber espionage and breaching sanctions regime. So it's in a sense we see the pattern of operation. We know the capacity and the ambition, and that's sort of even for the legal advisor has to work or lag somewhere in the back of their mind when they also considering this issue from a risk basis. And then, of course, we have the recent, in terms of product security, we have the recent report of the UK Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre, which stated that they have found significant technical deficiencies in some of Huawei's products, and they, or even the sort of production chain, and they cannot offer concrete, or they can only provide limited assurance that the risks to UK national security from Huawei's involvement in UK's critical networks can be sufficiently mitigated in the long term. And then we have the security environment. We know that economy is China's preferred approach to exerting strategic influence globally. We know that the country has pursued persistently a technological superiority or self-sufficiency agenda over about the past decade, investing heavily into its tech sector, its R&D, subsidizing the technology sector and the communications sector or in particular within that. And we know of existing market barriers to foreign providers, which give the local economy and local suppliers clearly unbeatable economies of scale, considering the scope of the Chinese market. And then there's the legal and political environment. There is the Chinese National Intelligence Law of 2016, which requires all companies to support and provide assistance to and cooperate in national intelligence work and guard the secrecy of any such intelligence work that they are aware of. And then the promise and the legal guarantee from the state that the state shall protect individuals and organizations that support and cooperate with and collaborate with in national intelligence work. And a similar provision exists in national counterintelligence law, which requires all domestic companies and individuals and entities to provide information and facilities and other assistance to the state for the purposes of counterintelligence, and mandates or prohibits those entities of refusing cooperation. So taken together, these acts don't really leave much assurance regarding judicial or public oversight to constrain the introduction of backdoors into the 5G solutions, should the state deem this necessary for the broad notion of maintaining state security. And of course, given the political context, where such requests are normally complied with rather than contested, and I've grown up in an autocratic regime, so I know that the civil disobedience is not really something you contemplate too heavily in a system like that. So the companies are normally not inclined to or to not comply with such requests. So where does it leave us in terms of international law? To pull the pyramid together, the primary risk of using Chinese 5G technology comes from the influence exerted over Chinese companies by their government and military, and the criticality that 5G is expected to have to the functioning of our sort of societal and economic system. So we know that the capacity is there to conduct cyber operations. The conducive environment is there. We know the track record, and but we still lack the smoking gun. So one could ask what assurances the international law and treaty regimes offered to constrain China's potentially malicious behavior. And the previous speaker again outlined the examples and sort of the walkthroughs pretty systematically and clearly for all of us. So the honest answer is, when it comes to dealing with risks, not much. We know that acts of espionage are normally punishable under domestic law. We know that international law, public international law, doesn't really address those issues much, unless the particular operation or the particular activities breach or certain thresholds or constitute malicious or prohibited a breach of international obligations per se. All of those require a certain sort of coming over a certain threshold, require tangible effect, and require clear state involvement. So to the stage where we are still talking only about a risk rather than an actual incident, we have a toolbox, but we really need for sort of the risk to materialize before we can start drawing upon that toolbox to respond. And for most countries, or if not all of them, this is not really where we want to go. So, and I will hop over this, but I think that given the slides will be available later, the outline of the division of the national responses is there. So, so where does it leave us as the legal community and the national legal advisors in terms of being able to offer credible legal tools and legal advice to our governments, especially where we are facing a situation where we are becoming increasingly aware of the risk, and we know that the risk mechanism must be supported by national law, but the international mechanisms don't really support us much. Somebody has wisely said that if you are looking for the smoking gun, and if you can actually see the smoking gun, it means that we've probably already been hit, or very, very likely. So, so we, sort of summarizing, we really need, especially as a coming from a small state again, we cannot really afford this division of competence where our legal experts on the one hand are well trained in international law, and our policy and our technical and national cybersecurity strategy is driving us in a direction where we are aiming to invest more into resilience and preventing and improving our defenses. So the legal community has to offer strategy and policymakers with credible options. And I've, especially from sort of my a bit of a blended role of a legal researcher at the CCD COE, and having fairly recently worked for the Estonian National Cybersecurity Agency, we see that we are, as the legal community, we are often providing tools that are intellectually stimulating, but that the practitioners and the national sort of cybersecurity strategy really cannot draw upon. And again, the small state reality is that you probably cannot function in a setup where you have a piece of expertise, piece of detail-specific expertise in one house, and in international law, and then maybe on international trade law or the Network and Information Security Directive in another house, and intellectual property or also data protection law in a fourth house, and hoping that these will like, in a sense combined provide meaningful and working answers to the national resilience building efforts. So I would really advocate for, rather than viewing this as a comprehensive issue, meaning the sum of individual elements, we really need to become better in terms of integrating the legal expertise, but also integrating in how lawyers are able to advise strategic level of a nation and the policymakers as well as the technical community. So the sort of the integrated learning process where lawyers become better digitally literate, and the technical community understands the basics of the law is something that bears a more practical significance in our work as the Center of Excellence as well. So sorry for keeping your attention for so long and taking away or sort of snatching your chance to your time to ask questions, but hopefully we'll have time to discuss in the following session. Thanks very much.
So I will actually follow up on your main conclusion, and you as the main editor of the recent Center's paper on trends in international law are also best suited to answer my question about the future. So do you see like a common approach or a common policy crystallizing internationally among various states, or is it more of a situation of fragmentation when you, for example, look at the EU negotiations or EU developments in this regard? I would like to know your opinion about possible like, developments also with regard to international law based on this.
I think I'm still stealing your question and twisting the angle of it. What I think I see is a capacity gap. Mm-hmm. We have the example of the US and large European allies that are investing heavily in also upgrading and sort of pushing forward or pulling forward the international law discussion by state practice. And then we have the majority of the countries in the world who will never rise to that scale. Also, in terms of expertise, being very reliant on the bigger allies, which is a strength of the NATO alliance on the one hand, but it also means that the realities and sort of the playground is defined by larger actors, and the smaller states have difficulty meaningfully and responsibly operating in that. So I'm not sure it by far answers your question, but this is the sort of the concern that I've had watching this discussion roll out.
Yep. Thank you. So questions from the audience? Oh, Kubo Machak.
Thank you. Thank you, Kadri, for your really thought-provoking and very interesting presentation. And it's so my name is Kubo Machak, University of Exeter. And it's really nice that we have both, or two of the three authors. So Tomasz, feel free to chip in as well. For me, one of the very interesting conclusions of your report was that Western states, and I think I quote almost exactly, that Western states are in principle free to ban Chinese products, including the products by Huawei. And so I just wanted to see if you could tease out a little bit more the implications of this and the analysis of this conclusion from the perspective of international law. I think in the report you say that this would be subject to the relevant international trade law exceptions, and then you suggest that it's the essential security interest exception that would apply. But I would put it to you that that exception under international law is very, very restrictive, and you would be able to identify basically that this would relate to measures taken in a situation of an international emergency. And so I was just wondering how you were thinking about this particular issue, if it would come to that some states would decide to take up your conclusion on this particular legal matter. How would they justify it under the applicable international trade law framework? Thank you.
Shall I take it?
Sure.
Well, you can probably suspect that we didn't have an international trade lawyer. Also, the limitations of small states in the drafting group of the report. The conclusion we reached was that in broad terms, by means of exercising sovereignty, states are also free to choose essentially the critical, how they lay out or whom they accept in the market as critical for the purpose of critical components of their fundamental infrastructure, and then subject to multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, which of course sort of do put or do uphold the national security clause in pretty straightforward terms. The particular provision of the GATT that we referred to was, according to our findings, deliberately phrased in a broad and inclusive manner. So only blatant examples of sort of misuse of that provision would fall outside of its scope. So everything that remotely looks like a national security interest can pretty plausibly be considered or sort of taken into that exception. But of course, this is where this is pretty much where our insight stopped, because we were really breaching the surface in that discussion and didn't explore much further, especially as the sort of what I appreciate about the European approach is that there is more. The emerging consensus seems to give more room for sort of conscious risk management, allowing to take those different economic and social interests into account next to the security interests.
Any more questions?
Call on some midshipmen if you want. I could call on some midshipmen if you want.
Frank, yes. Sure, yeah, of course, yeah. Now it's
Yeah, because
I love that.
so Przemysław Roguski, once again. So coming back to the SAMSAM example and the link that has been proposed between persistent engagement and SAMSAM. So let's do a hypothetical. Let's hypothesize that the US would have established which command and control server is responsible for spreading this SAMSAM malware. Would it be covered under persistent engagement if for the US to go in and turn that server off if it was in red space, let's say in Iran, or gray space somewhere in Zimbabwe, let's say? And if yes, what would be the legal justification under international law for doing that? Thank you.
I mean, I think obviously it would be very fact specific, and it would look at issues such as what other harms were being caused and so forth, and is it continuing to be used? Because again, one of the limitations is to have them cease the unlawful action. So I think there are a lot of very specifics. I think it could be as a countermeasure. But I mean, I think you're moving toward a justification for that, but I think we would need a lot more facts for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.